Welcome everyone to today's podcast. It's very exciting. We have Axel Carlson. Some of you can guess it's a Nordic name. And Axel is a global leader in McKinsey and Company. Turns out we actually studied together. Axel had much better grades than I did, so that's why
I'm not sure about that, Henrik, but yeah, anyway.
I am. But one thing I saw when I looked at your LinkedIn profile is you've been now with McKinsey for roughly 2.5 decades. So, I mean, you've been fortunate to then see a bunch of industries change dramatically. And just to kick it off, I would love to hear a bit about you yourself and the journey in McKinsey and what made you stay for 2.5 decades.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here, first of all, Henrik, and congratulations on all your success with Gelato. No, but I, after going to university with you, I did a summer internship with McKinsey precisely 25 years ago, and I was planning to stay a couple of years. But after those years, I was still enjoying myself, and I guess McKinsey is the type of place you get the promotion, and then you have to stay a couple of years, and then something good happens again, and then you have to stay a bit more. So I never really got the chance to leave. Spent a few years in the US, became partner 2006, led McKinsey Sweden from 2010. Then I moved to Asia. So I did 5 years in Hong Kong leading tech, media, telecoms for Asia. And then moved back to Sweden during the pandemic, because as I guess most of you know, Scandinavia was a bit better during COVID than China. So we moved back here, and now I lead what's called the global operations practice, which is where we do our cost-cutting work in purchasing, supply chain, manufacturing, those type of things. It's about 1/3 of the global McKinsey. And I'm also a global board member of McKinsey now since a year back. So 25 years later, I've never got the chance to leave, and I'm actually still enjoying myself, believe it or not.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, obviously, as I said, you're very close to many industries. What is the industry that has surprised you the most during these 2.5 decades? What's been the kind of most exciting change process to work with?
There's so many. So it's
outside of course, our
yeah, exactly. But it's almost hard to pick. But of course, I mean, I've done a lot of tech telecoms work, and to see the development of mobile phones over these years, right? When the GSM came, and then 3G came, color screens, the iPhone, all the apps. I mean, it's of course a remarkable development.
Yeah, I remember when I sent the first SMS. That's how old I am. I thought that was pretty cool.
Exactly. So I mean, that's of course fascinating. Software development, how software is developed today versus how it was developed 25 years ago. The price point for making a phone call. I don't know if you remember when we went to school and you were going to call abroad, that was like $1 per minute. I mean, there's so many things.
Yeah, I actually remember when I was an exchange student in Seattle, and I was calling collect, and my father didn't pick up because he thought it was too expensive.
Yeah, I had one of my best friends was in New Zealand for a year, and I wasn't allowed to call him because that was like $4 a minute. So, yeah.
So let's jump into today's podcast, and part of the background is we did a project with McKinsey last year for about 3 months, and we asked McKinsey to look into kind of 2 things. Number one, the production on demand industry, the manufacturing industry, and then also the creator economy. And so what's really interesting is to see that this industry we're speaking about today is impacted by rapid technological change in the manufacturing industry, coupled with the growth in the creator economy. And so when you think about it, what are the most exciting trends that you saw and you are thinking about when it comes to the manufacturing industry and the creator economy, and how those two will coexist now?
So what's unique about the space is there are so many very interesting and positive trends that I think we could have a podcast for 2 days to talk about all of them.
But, too long.
But to start, I mean, first of all, the whole creator space is, of course, very interesting. How it's growing, what the creators are doing, and how they have a need for merchandise and various production services. I mean, that's of course one big trend, and to play in a field where you benefit from that trend is of course very interesting. Secondly, if you look at production hubs or print facilities or wherever merchandise is produced, most of those are very small by kind of any international standard. And it's very difficult for those production hubs to leverage best practice to become as efficient as they can today with software, production flows, purchasing, logistics. So there's a big opportunity in helping them improve their efficiency. And then if you add on that Gelato's position as being a facilitator of the business between the creators and the production hubs, you have an asset-light model where you're basically facilitating that exchange, and you can hopefully then benefit from both the trends on the creator side and the opportunity to make the production side more efficient. So that's what we found so interesting.
Many of the listeners probably don't have that long-term relationship with the creator economy. And I read in a recent study from Goldman Sachs that the creator economy is $250 billion today, moving towards $500 billion in 3-4 years from today. So if you could just, from your perspective, what is the creator like in the microcosmic? And then what is the creator economy at a more macro global level?
Yeah. So first of all, I'll start with excusing myself and say that I'm maybe not the biggest expert on creators, but I'll do my best. So I'll explain it how I think of it at least. Well, if you think about bloggers, or you think about musicians, or you think about anyone who has something to publish or share with the public, many of these 10, 15, 20 years ago were part of bigger organizations, and they leveraged these organizations to sell goods or share music, or they produced records, or they whatever.
They had to go to like Sony, or
they would go to Sony or whatever. Yeah. And I mean, if they were painters, they would go to an art gallery and share their paintings. So I mean, you have all of these people who are creating things, if it's music or if it's art, whatever it may be. What has happened in the world over the last decade or 2 decades is that these people have a bit better opportunity than ever before to go on their own to the marketplace through all types of web tools, through all types of marketplaces.
And when you say web tools and marketplaces, like, is a web tool Canva or Adobe, and a marketplace Shopify, Etsy, and
Yeah, can be, and it can be whatever, of course, right? I mean, you can have your own blog and you can market things in your blog, or you can be an artist and you market your music through all kinds of channels and people get to know you, but can also be the marketplaces that you're alluding to. So it can be really whatever. But I mean, the big development is technology has facilitated decoupling those creators from the organizations like record labels or art galleries that used to promote them. And now they're able to promote themselves. And it's also become much easier to become what we then call creator. It's just, you can go out on the web and you can publish whatever stuff you may have.
I mean, even you and I are creators now today.
Yeah, even that. We may not be the most prolific creators, but
we're not the youngest ones.
Not the youngest ones either, but creators of some sort. And all of this has, of course, fueled that market. And these creators, of course, produce various things: printed products, merchandise, clothes, whatever it may be. So they also have a need for various types of production. And that production before was handled through the organizations that the creators worked for. But now when they're on their own, that whole market has been a bit disrupted, you could say.
And if you think about that, if a creator today, let's take one of our creators, Just Line in Portugal. It's a couple, she's a marketeer and he's an engineer, a programmer. And all of a sudden, through the combination of Shopify, PayPal, Adyen, and Gelato, they can start selling to billions of consumers. And so it would be interesting to see how the global macro economy, the creator economy, is connecting to the manufacturing industry, and why, from McKinsey's perspective and your experience, why it is exciting to see local production as a connection to the creator economy?
Yeah. So first of all, the interesting thing on the creator side is that the scale has actually reduced. So what used to be pretty big organizations creating things 20 years ago are now often individuals. And those individuals, of course, have no scale in setting up their own production. If they need to produce printed products, clothes, whatever it may be, they can't have a print facility on their own. They need to collaborate with someone who has this production facility. So therefore, I mean, there's a bigger opportunity than there used to be to help these creators connect with production facilities. And then as I started this chat, on the production side, the production landscape is very, very fragmented. So, some industries are super consolidated and you're dealing with companies with, tens of $billions in turnover. Many of the production hubs are very small. They often don't turn over more than $1 million per year. Quite often family businesses. And as I said, also, they make investment in production technology, printers, machines, whatever it may be. And those investments are, of course, big investments for such small family businesses. So it's very important for the production facilities to get high utilization. But that's also very difficult for them because they are as small as they are. So as you see, the market development has been quite interesting in this space, and that we have more creators than ever before, as we were talking about, growing very rapidly with a huge opportunity for individuals to produce their stuff, market their stuff on the web. And at the same time, they have a real need for production facilities. They can't set it up on their own. And the landscape for production is very fragmented. And I think that's where you and Gelato come in and can play a quite interesting role.
Yeah, and when we did the work together with you, we also saw that, and I brought this up on a number of occasions, that 10 years ago when we visited, you say print hub or print facility, some of the listeners will find printing as a name to be pretty boring and pretty scary. Everyone thinks that print is dying, but another way of addressing that is to say production on demand at global scale with local partners. So these production on demand facilities, when we go back 10 years, they kind of had one machine and they did one product. But the growth of the creator economy, the consumer demand has during the last decade, it's moved towards more and more personalized items and also more and more different types of product categories. So today when we go and we visit the production facility, it's very common to see machines from 4, 5, 6 vendors, and that they cover not one product category, but 10, 20, 30, 40. So what I think, and we'll come to that now in this podcast, but what I think is a problem for the industry, the manufacturing industry, is that you sit with many different softwares to manage the production. They don't speak to one another. And so that's one of the reasons why we engage with you, Axel and McKinsey, because we really needed to understand from the production and manufacturing industry's perspective, what are their challenges? And so you met and interviewed 92 production partners. And let's move into that a bit, like the overall size of this industry, the size of the problem at a very high level, and then we can kind of digest and dissect the different pieces. But what did you see when you did these interviews, when you met the production partners?
Yeah, I'll start a little bit bottom up, so you also get my background and our background when we do this type of analysis. So we're very used to working with large companies as McKinsey, and we're also, one of our biggest service lines is to review manufacturing facilities and production facilities and identify productivity gains opportunities. That's what all our clients are looking for. But we typically work with the big folks who've been doing productivity improvements for 30 years. And they're so big, so they have whole teams for finding productivity improvements. And then they bring in McKinsey on top to find even more. When we went out and met your production partners, what we realized was these guys have a very hard time to drive those productivity improvements because they're so subscale, they're quite small, and they just haven't had the capacity to bring in consultants or leverage best practice. And if you look at workflow as one example, I mean, as you described already, they may have production equipment from 6 different vendors with 6 different softwares, and it doesn't help them create a unified production flow. So to make a long story short, what we saw when we went out there is basically that they, first of all, struggle with their profitability quite often because they have low utilization and a hard time to get the productivity improvements in place. But also that the opportunity for productivity improvements is absolutely huge because they just...
When you say productivity improvement, Axel, what do you mean with productivity improvements? Because just at a high level, if we jump in a helicopter and fly up and look down at a production facility, you see the materials coming in, the whole procurement of that. Then production is happening, which you refer to as the workflow between the machines, and it's pre-press, it is the actual production, it is post-press. And then at the other side of the facility comes a truck and picks it up, which is the logistical part. So if you would just, what do you mean with profitability here, and what do you mean with productivity?
Yeah, so first of all, you can divide the revenue side and the cost side to start with. And if you start with the revenue side, you can, of course, measure utilization of the production equipment. And it's very difficult for subscale production facilities to have a high utilization. So that's the first thing where I think Gelato, you've helped your customers for a long while with improving utilization through channeling demand to production hubs. So that's, of course, the first opportunity for productivity improvement.
Can I also, sorry to interrupt you, but I'd like to add one thing. One thing that has been hugely helpful for us when we drive productivity improvements is that we can take 10,000 orders per day, and we can leverage, if you take books, for example, we can place many books on the same sheet so we can produce them in parallel, and thereby optimizing both the space of each sheet, but also, of course, the throughput in the machines. So the actual ganging or bundling of orders and then shipping it out to the production hubs in itself is a huge reason for why we can give productivity improvements to our partners.
Right. So that the revenue side, I mean, you've been doing for a while, and I think that's part of your success, that you're able to help production facilities improve utilization. Then if you look at the cost side, you can start by saying the first step is kind of procurement or purchasing of the input goods like paper or whatever material you're going to produce something on. You need to purchase the input materials. Then you need to manage the flow within the production facility, and then you need to ship it or have some logistics at the end. You can divide it in these 3 steps. And first of all, the input cost purchasing in itself has huge scale advantages. So of course, if you pool demand and you increase demand with 10 times, 50 times, 100 times, and you buy all of that at once, of course you get a better price. So firstly, there's a quite simple productivity gain in purchasing.
So that's kind of a network effect in a way, by working together with a number of smaller production facilities. If we do that, the network effect combined gives us bargaining power and ability to negotiate effectively.
Exactly. And nothing gets worse. It's the same stuff you buy, you just get a better price. Secondly is the workflow through the production facility. And here, this was one of our big observations. I mean, as I already alluded to, if you have equipment from 6 different vendors from different generations, and there's no unified software to guide the flow through the facility, it's impossible to get the best possible productivity out of that facility. And there's the second opportunity for you with your workflow management system to help production facilities get a better workflow. So that's kind of opportunity number 2.
And when you look at that, fortunately, sometimes you don't know when you start the journey how difficult it is. So we never understood that we were actually not supposed to be able to build one single software to manage all the machines. Because we actually didn't know anything about printing. We knew a lot about software and billing and those type of traditionally non-industry related challenges. So the fact that we did not own any assets, from your perspective, that's both a blessing and a curse in a way. But a bit from the outside in, how do you look at the fact that Gelato from day one said that we will never own any assets? We will never put any fixed assets on the balance sheet.
Well, I mean, the many reflections on that from different angles. But first, you can say for you as a company, that's, of course, a huge blessing because, I mean, a production hub is very, very asset heavy. And for Gelato, that you're not owners of that, but helpers of that and helping improve productivity and output is, of course, a much better position to have than to have a very heavy balance sheet. Secondly, for this opportunity in itself with software and being a non-vendor specific software, that position is, of course, very difficult to take for someone who is themselves a producer of the machines. So I think to take this position, it was probably, I don't know if it was a precondition, but almost to be asset light, to be able to take that role.
And one thing you spoke about, speaking about asset light versus asset heavy, when we did the project together, you said in the prolonging of this, you should, as a production hub, be able to leverage other production hubs' fixed assets and thereby being much more intelligent and be able to optimize when do you invest in a new machine and what machine do you if you can speak a bit about that consequence of our partnerships with production hubs around the planet and from what you saw there.
Yeah, no, and I mean, this is back to what I call utilization of the production equipment. And if you are a subscale production hub, like 99% of them are, it's very difficult to have a very high utilization of your expensive production equipment. If you then can pool capacity in a network and you use production assets better, let's say you double the utilization, then you can have half as many assets. And of course, the profits in the system across the network go up significantly if you suddenly could have half the amount of assets. And that will also, of course, benefit the production hubs if they are part of the network, so they don't need to invest themselves, but they can leverage what others already invested in. So this is exactly what I was alluding to when I say the opportunity includes raising the utilization of these very underutilized production assets in subscale production hubs.
That's just so incredibly interesting. And of course, also there is another benefit in this, which is the sustainability aspect.
Of course, yeah. So, I mean, you don't have to ship so much if you can find a local producer somewhere and they have the right equipment. That's great from a sustainability angle as well. And you can use the production equipment that has the lowest CO2 footprint or from a circularity point of view, whatever you assess.
Yeah, and if you think about that also, I don't only think that it's good for the production hubs, but I also think, again, that the consumers will expect and demand more of those type of products.
Yeah, and here we come. You mentioned before, Henrik, that many products get a longer and longer tail of SKUs. And to just say a few more words about that, I mean, product variants in modern society have a tendency to just increase and increase because more people want something unique for themselves. And when the average batch size goes down and you have to deal with a long tail of SKUs, it's, of course, more difficult to do that production and keep it in stock and also deal with the sustainability dimension. So if you can have a way of dealing with that through this type of network effect, that's, of course, great as well. And you can make the customer happy by producing a wider range of SKUs.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thanks for that. Then if we go back to these three sections of production facility, you spoke a bit about the procurement, we went into the workflow, and then I interrupted you when you were going to logistics, but...
No, and I mean, just on logistics, first of all, we already touched upon the sustainability dimension. So first of all, maybe you can reduce the need for logistics to some extent by choosing a hub closer to where you need to be. Secondly, there's, of course, the purchasing saving on the logistics as well, from pooling the capacity and the optimization through the network effect. So to make the long story short, in each of these three steps, in the input material sourcing, through the workflow, and on the logistics, we saw huge productivity improvement opportunities. And by having a unified software and pooling volume in the whole logic that we've been discussing, it's of course a great way to address that. And then you can of course ask, how big is then that? Well, the whole production hub industry has been challenged with low profitability. So you can say it's for sure single-digit EBIT numbers. And
it is the bottom line, the profit margins, right?
Yeah, the profit margins. So, I mean, you can say that if you look at the system as a whole, you can for sure double, maybe triple the profit margins in the system by the current solutions that you could think of in this network effect. And I think over time, you could do more. And you can develop this to also address other productivity challenges that we haven't discussed yet here.
And those are big numbers. But what made you confident in those numbers? I mean, one thing you did was you sent your one of your supply chain experts, the team actually, I think there were like 6-7 people, with 2 of our production partners for 2 days each. And if we can just kind of at a high level break down where those profitability gains and the cash flow can be captured if you look at procurement, workflow, and logistics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first of all, just on what we did and so on. I mean, we don't do work by just listening to folks like yourself and putting on paper what they say. We actually try to go out in the reality and see what's possible. So what we did and what we do for all our clients is that we go to the factory with our experts. So we have a team of experts. Some are procurement experts, other are production and workflow experts, and some are logistics experts. And then we go through for a few days the whole production facility. We can then compare that with our benchmarks for what are the production hubs in the world that do this in the best way and what KPIs do they achieve. So that's what we do. And that's what we call a factory walkthrough or a production hub walkthrough. So what we said to you, Henrik, as you will remember, is we won't just take your word for it. We actually want to go out to your production partners and do this in reality, which we did with 2 of the partners, which was a terrific collaboration. And I think they also appreciated if you...
I was going to say, I actually spoke to one of the CEOs of these 2 companies that you went and visited. And he repeated just last week how much they appreciated that and how much they've actually been able to change and realize thanks to that study. So you're totally to the point, and that's a shout out to you.
Yeah, no. So, but it was a terrific experience for us as well. But that's how we got to our numbers, right? So then we look at, so when you purchase your input material, how do you do that? What are you paying? How do you negotiate? Show us the prices you're using. And then we compare that with our benchmarks. And that's how we kind of arrive at the potentials. And then if we start with, sorry.
No, I would just like to add one thing there before we move to workflow. Like, one thing we discussed a lot was also the optimization of the balance sheet. So once you are able to connect the time you scan the merchandise or the finished produced product, it automatically goes to replenishment, the replenishment software in the procurement part, so that you can optimize your warehousing and thereby unleash cash, a lot of cash on the balance sheet. So there is both the cost saving, But then there is the balance sheet optimization. And then there is also the opportunity to do that more effectively, because we have procurement experts that are working with 140 partners today across the planet. So there are a couple of components on procurement and logistics that has broad implications.
Absolutely. No, and when we talk about procurement on this or productivity on this podcast, we're not just talking about, time in a specific machine or so. It's also, of course, the capital tied up in the whole process. It's really an integrated view. But in any case, just to conclude on the procurement, the finding was, the production hubs are very subscale. And also, as you described before, they produce many different things that require very different input materials. So they, not quite list price, but they're almost like going out to the suppliers and they get a price close to the list price. And then if you start evaluating, if you pool this demand, what are the prices achieved by others? And see the difference is quite dramatic. So that's how we kind of verify the purchasing savings. Similarly, then with workflow, basically seeing from you get an order until it's out of the shop, how does this go through the shop floor? How is the workflow managed? What software are you using? What time does it take? How much capital does that tie up? So it was a quite detailed nitty-gritty productivity assessment end to end for each of those production hubs. And then similarly, finally, for logistics, both from a purchasing point of view, but also from how much logistics would you need if you leverage the full network effect. So it was a bottom-up analysis done for 2 of the production partners, and then kind of scaled to see what would this mean from a network perspective.
A couple of points here. When we speak about workflow, I visited one production hub and I asked the COO, the chief operating officer for the production hub, if you could make one wish, what would that be? And she said, I would want the whole workflow in my mobile phone. Because when you sit at Gelato building the software, it's hard for you to see my daily life, because I go to the digital production part of our facility, and it's kind of like 700 meters away from my desktop. So I don't want to have to go to my desktop, do the changes, and then go back. So being able to see the whole facility in my mobile phone is like my number one wish. And so that is the software power that up until now, this industry has not been able to access, which brings me to the other point that I wanted just to add to your summary. When it comes to logistics, what we often see is that there is a ton of manual work to just get out an address label, just to manage a single package. And that doesn't include being able to optimize what carrier to use to what end address or even to what country, right? So when you break down the cost advantages, what would you say about the software power versus the cost reduction, and how does that divide from your perspective? It might be a bit difficult question, but
no, I would even say that for me they're the same thing almost. So what I would say is that if you take cost savings like purchasing, well, if you don't have a software so that you can pool your purchasing goods, how do you then do it? Doing that manually across a network will be very, very difficult. You need a software, so it just happens automatically. To address the workflow and capital tied up end to end in the process, you need digital tools to do that. So I think for us, it's 2 sides of the same coin, that if you don't have the software support for the end to end process, this is something that's very difficult to do. Also because it's a fragmented network. If you had production partners that were 5 billion euro each, then it's a different thing, because then they all have the scale to optimize. Now you have small production partners, they need the support from such a software to make that happen. So I actually think that the questions become unified and that they need the digital support to enable it.
I mean, we're approaching the end of this podcast, but a couple of more questions. When you went to speak to these production hubs, how do you perceive this shift? How did they relate to the shift in consumer demand, which is kind of moving from standardized mass production somewhere across the planet to highly personalized, highly localized production, and then supporting the e-commerce industry, really? How do they navigate that? Like, did they find it energizing, difficult, challenging? What's your summary from your perspective?
Yeah, all of the above is probably the summary. So what do I mean with that? Well, clearly, many of these production hubs live in a pretty tough reality. So they have lacking profitability. They feel the need to improve profitability. They have customers that are putting pressure on the price points. So they're facing a difficult reality in many ways, which of course is tough. And I think some of them wonder, how do I cope with this? How do I deal with this and come out in a better place? And then I think comes the positive side, that I think if you can harness the long tail of SKUs that we were talking about before, you can actually often get a higher price point from some of these. You can actually have a lower or less of a heavy balance sheet if you leverage the network effect that we were talking about. You can get lower input prices if you leverage the network effect. So I think once they see a future through what we're talking about here, I think they react very positively. And I think many of your partners have therefore jumped on the train in a very excited way. But I'm also sure that, it's not a journey without its small problems along the way, and it will be a long change journey before you're there. And I also think where we started a bit, right? If you work with a production facility that's $10 billion US, they've been driving productivity efforts and new software tools for 20 years. Some of these production hubs, they haven't, because they were subscale. They couldn't afford that. And there were no tools available for them. And now when there are, it's of course a journey to fully embrace that and fully get that as well. But I'm quite positive, I must say, from what I saw. But I think you have an information gap and an information space to fill. But maybe we fill some of that through podcasts like this one.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I was reflecting upon, since the listeners will not get an invoice from you, so now we can leverage your guidance here and knowledge and experience. If you would have a presentation for one of the 92 production hubs that you connected to during this study, what would be the kind of sober 2-3 strong recommendations from your side to a production hub somewhere in the Gelato network across this planet? And also, what I like about working, with you, Axel, was that you were very, I wouldn't call it harsh, but you were very to the point on some changes we had to do, but also some changes that the production partners had to do. So some of the listeners might feel, when you use words such as subscale or small production hubs, some of the listeners might take offense. I know you, so what you're really saying is just the truth. It's just a fact. But in that environment, what would be your recommendations, the 2-3 bullet points the listener should take away and go and do in their production hub?
Well, I think you can summarize by saying a vast majority of production hubs have a profitability challenge. They're not making enough money to really cover their cost of capital, and the capital demands are high. So that is an issue. To address that issue, there is an opportunity to improve productivity. We've proven it, I'm totally convinced. And that can enable at least a doubling of profit margin, probably more. I think the question that each production hub owner needs to deal with is, how do I enable that? How can I make that happen? There can be many ways to do that, but I think it's very hard to understand any other path forward than to embrace that challenge. And also, to be clear, that means actions both on the revenue side as well as on the cost side. So it both means ensuring enough customers and enough utilization to really have top-notch utilization of the machines, which is back to the network effect and how Gelato has helped your customers for a long time. But it is also a unified production flow, pooling purchase demand, pooling logistics, reducing the need for logistics. And I mean, there are just two things to play with. It's more money in and less cost out, and then you get to higher profitability. So I think this is the recipe. It's hard to see another recipe. Then I think they also have to embrace it will take some time. None of this happens easily and overnight. So they will have to work hard for it and leverage support, for example, from you, Henrik, and others who are doing this type of thing. But if they do that, I'm quite sure they will have a brighter future with a profitability that more matches their cost of capital.
Mm. So it's a good thing we studied 4 years at Stockholm School of Economics. And we learned more money in and less money out.
Exactly.
That's the secret recipe. So last question for me, Axel. Now we have worked together. You deep dived into this industry, the creator economy, and how it links to production on demand. You spoke many times about these single entrepreneurs that have millions of followers. You spoke about the artists of Spotify and how they would be able to leverage their brand and their listeners and followers across the planet through the creator economy. When you think about production on demand in the manufacturing industry, I often say that local production is actually about enabling global trade at scale, but in a greener, smarter, and faster way. From your perspective, what would you like to see? What do you believe will happen coming 2-3 years in the space between creator economy and local production on demand?
It's a big question, and I could go on forever and ever. But I think, first of all, this system that we're discussing today on the podcast, where you enable through a network effect production hubs to be more efficient and get higher utilization. That is, of course, a huge opportunity also in areas beyond the type of production of printing or closed production or whatever it is we're discussing here today. You could think of that in other types of production as well. I'm quite convinced we will start to see that happen, because the benefits from structurally having a higher utilization on very capital intensive machinery is a huge opportunity in many industries. So therefore, I think that I'm sure we will see the exact forms. Let's see exactly what happens. But I believe maybe Gelato could play a role there as well in other industries. I think the other thing is, of course, geopolitics, which I think we're getting into and you can't avoid. Because, when we work with larger clients, it's not only about optimizing for utilization, etc., like we discussed here today. It's also, what's happening in the world. And there's big changes happening on supply chains, also driven by that. And also driven by various risk considerations that are bigger now than they have been for the past 20 years. So I think it's a multifaceted picture where not everything is driven just by productivity or environmental gains like we're mostly discussing here, but it's also driven by other factors. But I'm totally convinced there will be an interesting 20 years to come to follow. And then we sit there and we reflect back. We'll say we missed something probably anyway.
Yeah, and if we think about how fast the last 2.5 decades has gone since we left school, that's going to feel like next year. So thank you so much for investing your time in speaking to us, Axel. And I'm excited about how our production hubs can utilize the work you did and how we've been able to kind of paint the picture of the future ahead thanks to this collaboration. So appreciate the time spent, and then we have some work to do, and we'll speak soon again.
Thank you so much. Pleasure as always.
Take care.